Well, if you're brand new with us, my name's Dylan. I'm one of the pastors here. Super excited that you're here with us, especially if maybe you're not from a church background. Maybe this is your first time ever in church, first time back in church in a long time. We're absolutely thrilled to have you today as we kick off, I think, literally the longest teaching series we've ever done called the Summer of Love. It will literally be the next 3 months. It's going to be a lot of fun. You'll be hearing from a lot of different folks in this series. I'm going to preach a couple times here in June, and then the rest of the series in August, and in the intervening time you'll hear from I think three or four other different folks, and it's really going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to listening to some good preaching. I think it'll be a blessing to you guys as well. If you have a Bible and you want to follow along, we're actually going to be a lot of different places today. We'll start in 1 Peter, then head over to 1 Corinthians, and then be in 1 Samuel, then Psalms and Romans, and back in 2 Peter. So a lot of bouncing around. If that makes you uncomfortable, it's okay. Everything will be on the screen, and you don't have to follow along. And full disclosure, that's probably what I would do myself. So, generally speaking, all of us have a significant problem with being patient, right? Right. In fact, go ahead and turn to your neighbor who's perhaps your spouse and just tell them, I have a patience problem. Confession is good for the souls, right, husbands? We have a patience problem. We have a difficult time waiting for things. But generally speaking, we actually don't have a hard time waiting for something that we value. So, for example, 2 years ago, it's the start of the pandemic. And also for me, like we had just had our first boy. And so my world is in upheaval. Things are totally different. We're stuck at home. Restaurants are still open, but you can only go and get takeout and that sort of thing. And so date night started to look very different for me and my wife. And one night where I think Kason was maybe like 4 weeks old, we're like, we want Thai food and we want Krispy Kreme. That requires us going to Raleigh. And so we took our 4-week-old up to Raleigh. He sat in the back. He was pretty okay while we ate Thai food. That was great. And then we're like, we're going to Krispy Kreme, dang it. We're going to Krispy Kreme. And usually that's not a problem when you can go in and sit down. But on this particular Friday night at this Krispy Kreme in Raleigh, the line was unimaginably long. You say, how unimaginably long? It took us 45 minutes to go through the drive-thru. 45 minutes. Now just imagine here, 45 minutes with a newborn. Here's what's going to happen with 45 minutes and a newborn. Typically, Kason was great when the car was moving. When the car stopped, he started getting antsy. And so at some point, I'm fairly certain my wife was the one driving because it was her vehicle. We swapped seats. She got in the back and fed him. At one point, I got back there and just held the pacifier in his mouth, begging him to be quiet. But at the end of the day, we waited for Krispy Kreme donuts. Why? Because dang it, we valued Krispy Kreme donuts. And yes, it was the worst drive-thru experience of our life, but the donuts at the end were worth it, especially when you're sleep-deprived and you just need some sugar to keep you going. This was before I discovered coffee, and now I've discovered coffee, and coffee and sugar is even better for getting you going. But we all have things in our life like that, right? We generally have a patience problem, but we don't mind waiting for something we value. What we have a problem with is waiting when something gets in the way of something that we value. So, for example, maybe you're taking your spouse on a date and you've made reservations and you've got to get there at this specific time. And because just the way marriage works, like you're running about 2 minutes late, so you need green lights to happen, but you get stopped at a red light and you're like in the number 2 position and the light finally turns green and you think the car in front of you is going to go, but they just sit there. Right? They sit there. So what all of us do after about 3 seconds? You sit on the horn. You're like, "Mrrr." And then, of course, they don't say thank you. They tell you you're number 1 and, all that sort of stuff. And they just get really frustrated with you. But what happens? It's like, I don't like waiting for something that I want. Maybe your struggle with waiting is you've got something to do online and the web page takes 15 seconds to load. And if you were born after 2000, then you think 15 seconds of waiting is long internet. You don't remember the dial-up days. When literally waiting for a page could be like, I don't know, a day commitment. Where like if you wanted to download Pocket, anybody else play Pocket Tanks except other than me? Okay, great, awesome, one other person. It was like a 2-hour commitment if you wanted to play Pocket Tanks, but that was slow internet. Or maybe just maybe your struggle with waiting is you think you have time to go to Walmart and you're like, well, I can go in real quick, but you fail to remember that there is no such thing as a quick trip into Walmart because they only ever have 2 lines and one of the self-checkouts is never working. And so when you get in there, like it's a 25-minute commitment, and so you hop lines thinking that you're going to get through faster, but you get in the line where the person uses like 5 different payment methods and 3 of them get rejected. And so you're just sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting. And we don't like that because we're on a mission to get to something we value, and we don't like waiting for something that gets in the way of something we value. You say, what is the point of all that? Well, all of that is pretty humorous to joke about, right? But let's get serious for a little bit, because one of the biggest things we value is just being treated right by other people, right? Like, we want to be treated kindly. We want to be treated with respect. We want other people to trust us, and we want to trust them and all that, and all those sorts of things. But man, what happens when somebody treats you wrongly? Somebody betrays you. Somebody stabs you in the back. Somebody speaks unkindly about you. Somebody says one thing to you, but then goes and says something else about you to somebody else. People gossip about you. You're treated in a way that just isn't right. In those moments, like, we want that to be corrected pretty much immediately, right? Like, we don't really want to wait on that being fixed. But what happens when maybe you have a conversation, maybe you pray about it, maybe you put up with it for like a week? What happens when you're weeks into it, or maybe even months into it, or years into it, and man, it still ain't fixed? Can we just be honest? Sometimes we just get tired of waiting, right? And we just decide, you know what? I'm tired of waiting. It's payback time, right? Like, I'm either going to get even or I'm going to get one up. Like, I'm going to tell them exactly what I think. I'm going to rip them a new one. They gossip about me. I'm going to start saying stuff about them. And we just get frustrated with people. And in some cases, we're even willing to burn bridges with people because we're like, I'm so sick and tired of this that I'm just done with them. And it's understandable, right? Because the reality is this, you can write this down. We have a hard time waiting when we're treated wrongly. Have a hard time waiting when we're treated wrongly. And part of that, by the way, is just simply a reflection of the fact that you were made in the image of God. In fact, if you're here and you're not a Christian and you're kind of skeptical about the whole Jesus thing, part of the thing that actually points you to the fact that you were made by a God who is just is the fact that you have this sense of justice, this sense of things that are not right should be made right. That's because God made you to desire that. And ultimately, the greatest way justice was ever carried out was Jesus Christ dying on the cross for our sin, because even our death couldn't satisfy God's justice because we incurred an eternal debt. And the only way for that eternal debt to be paid was for somebody eternal in nature and infinite in goodness to die on our behalf, and that's what Jesus did, and the justice of God was carried out. So your desire for justice is simply a reflection of the fact that you're made in the image of God. And we may get that, but we get very, very frustrated when it takes a very long time for things to be set right? And the tendency is to want payback. Can we just admit we want payback, right? But let's also admit we're usually not very patient in the way we carry that out, right? Like, just say, for example, maybe this happened to you on the way, I don't know. Somebody cut you off in traffic, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to show them. No, they will never cut me off again. Now I'm going to get right up on their bumper. I'm going to turn my lights on, and I'm going to tell them they're number one. And that always makes so many friends and influences people, right? Doesn't it? Because, I mean, just think about it. You told somebody you've never met and will never meet how much of a whatever you are. Right? I mean, maybe you shouldn't tailgate. That's just a thought. Anyway. But we want payback, right? That there's something in us when we're wronged by somebody else, treated wrongly, we really, really, really want to pay other people back. But the reality is, man, that's not what we're called to. Because if you're a follower of Jesus, the reality is that actually means following Jesus. And this is what Peter points out. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. It says this. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, watch this, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to one who judges justly. Well, what we can't forget if you're a follower of Jesus is simply this. The greatest, while Jesus' death on the cross was the greatest act of justice on the part of God, it was also the greatest act of injustice ever perpetuated by human beings. Because Jesus, the innocent, perfect Son of God, was betrayed by one of his best friends. We forget that about Judas, right? Like Judas literally spent 3 years with Jesus, was close with Jesus, was part of Jesus' inner circle. Betrayed by one of his best friends, arrested by a corrupt religious system who claimed to worship God, who claimed to worship the Lord, and yet when Jesus said, hey, I'm the God you're supposed to be worshiping, they're like, yeah, but we're not really feeling it. So then the Jewish religious leaders conspired with people they hated, the pagan Gentile Roman government that was occupying their land, and like, hey, we hate this guy so much that even though he hadn't done anything really like criminally wrong, we want him to die a criminal's death, and not just any criminal's death, but the death of an insurrectionist. And they conspired with the Roman government to have him tortured and mutilated and hung bleeding and naked on a cross, even though Jesus had done nothing wrong. And here's the reality. If there was anybody who ever had the right to pursue payback, it was Jesus Christ in that moment. And let's just be honest, and this is one of the reasons why we're not God and God is God. If you were God in that moment, if I'm God in that moment, then when they're like, hey, we don't believe you're the Son of God, then it'd be like, okay, lightning bolt here, lightning bolt there, what do y'all think? Right? Because it'd be like, oh, I'll show y'all. But man, that's not what Jesus did. Instead, he just endured it. Instead, he didn't retaliate. He didn't seek payback. And the reason he did that was because what was required for those very people to be saved was for him to let them do exactly what they were doing and for him to die. The greatest act of injustice ever carried out by human beings, Jesus just endured it. And Peter's like, well, that's what you're called to. And the pushback there is like, well, yeah, but that's Jesus. Like, he's like God, even though he's fully human at the same time, he was fully God. There's that mystery there. Like that's Jesus. But man, if we're called to follow Jesus, then we're called to be like Jesus, right? Yes. And so Paul puts it this way. This is where we start our journey through 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8. He starts with this. He says, love is patient. Love is patient. What does love is patient mean? It doesn't just mean that when you get to a red light, you can sit there patiently without like tapping your foot and revving your engine. In the context here, what that actually is referring to is an idea that you could sum up like this. Love has a really long fuse with other people. That's the context. Love has a really, really long fuse with other people. Love is very, 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 very patient with other people. That's the context, especially when they are treating you wrongly. Love is patient. Now, here's the thing about patience, and maybe you've said this before. I'm fairly certain I've said this before. Nobody likes to pray for patience, right? Right? Like the joke is, well, I don't want to pray for patience because then I found every time I pray for patience, God gives me opportunities to be patient. You know what hit me last summer as I was starting on a journey where God was starting to slow me down, slow my pace of life down? I was like, I'm just an impatient person. And what God taught me in that season was, Dylan, here's reality. Until you can be patient, especially patient with people, then you can't actually really love people. Because the primary characteristic of love is that love is patient. In this context, love has a long fuse with other people. And man, for years I didn't get that. For years, even as a pastor, I didn't get that because I don't know that I've really been marked by great patience with people. And I'll give you an example because it's even come out in my preaching sometimes. Like, for instance, last August, I think I made a statement, super impatient. And even my tone of voice was great and all that sort of stuff. But I was like, hey, if you've been here for like a year and you're just not involved and you're never going to get involved, you just need to find a new church. And man, I thought it was okay for me to say that, but I talked to a mentor about that, and he's like, I just would never make that sort of statement. And afterwards, God so convicted me over just simply being impatient with people. That sort of thinking, just very, very impatient with people. And it was shortly after that God convicted me of, man, you got to be patient because until you're being patient with people, you're not being loving towards people. And patience doesn't draw a lot of hard red lines, and patience doesn't seek to just force people into situations, and patience certainly doesn't get back at people when they wrong you. The idea is this, you can write it down. Patience doesn't pursue payback. Patience does not pursue payback. And so we're going to look at a story today. If you've been in church, most of your life, you'll be familiar with it. If you haven't, it'll be a new story. But we're going to look at the interaction between two guys named David and Saul. And interestingly enough, when I preach again on Father's Day, we'll be right back in this story looking at it from a little different angle. But here's some background. Saul was the first king of Israel. He was anointed king, and he had all sorts of character flaws. He had a hard time obeying God. He was super insecure, really wanted to do what he wanted to do. And so God's like, okay, the kingdom's not going to be yours anymore. It won't be your family's. I'm going to anoint somebody else. And so God has a guy named David anointed, and David first steps on the scene by killing a guy named Goliath, who was a giant and that sort of thing. That's in another story. But this was a huge military victory for Israel, and it's in the wake of that story that we kind of pick up the interaction between Saul and David first. So 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 6, this is right after David kills Goliath. It says, when the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. By the way, this was just another way of saying that Saul and David have killed thousands. It was not a knock on Saul. But Saul, because he's insecure, was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me only with thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul, which, by the way, that might sound really weird. Why would God send an evil spirit on somebody? Well, when you rebel against God, God simply opens the door for you to reap the consequences of your rebellion. That's the idea here. Saul was rebellious against God, did not want to listen to him. So God's like, okay, you don't want to obey me, so the door is now open for you to reap the consequences. And it was this demonic presence that would torment him. And David actually would help Saul, because when David would come in and play, it actually would soothe Saul a little bit. So it says he was prophesying or babbling in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. So this happens 2 times. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody starts throwing spears at me, I'm probably not going to really have them as a part of my life. Can we agree with that? But interestingly enough, David sticks around. It's super gracious on David's part. Maybe he's like, well, Saul's just being Saul. Don't you have that person in your life, right? You're like, well, this is just Joe being Joe. If you're Joe in here, by the way, it's not a knock on you. By the way, it's like this is just this person being this person. It's just the way they are. And so David is just kind of patient. So he continues to serve Saul. And then so Saul tries to change tactics. Verse 17, Saul said to David, here's my oldest daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against them. Let the Philistines do that. Because Saul's like, well, maybe I can get the Philistines to kill David. But David said to Saul, who am I and what's my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law? So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now that's just wrong, right? Like if you're a single guy, like you're waiting to be married, you want to be married, and the king's like, I'll give you my daughter, and you're like, I get married. But then when the time comes for that to happen, she's given to somebody else. That's just not fair, right? But David continues to stick around. But there's actually hope for him. It says now Saul's daughter, Michal, was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so he'll be so distracted by this beautiful daughter of mine, so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him, and ultimately, in his mind, kill him. So Saul said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. And watch how David tries to get David, watch how Saul tries to get David out of the picture here. It says, Saul ordered his attendants, speak to David privately and say, look, the king likes you, and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law. They repeated these words to David, but David said, do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. And when Saul's servants told him what David said, Saul replied, say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. If you want to do deeper study on that, mark at LifeSpringNC.com. Would love to answer your questions on that. Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines, but this backfires on him because when the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David took his men with him and went out and killed not 100, but 200 Philistines and brought back their foreskins, which is gross on all sorts of levels. They counted out the full number to the king, so that the David might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of them. Then watch this. And he remained his enemy the rest of his days. I threw some verses on there that were not on the screen. And this says the Philistine commanders continued to go out in battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and he became well known. So Saul wants to kill David, and he tries multiple different ways to do this, and it just backfires. And so Saul's posture towards David is like, I want to get rid of this guy. And so in chapter 19, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David. And so Jonathan ends up warning him and saying, look, you need to be on your guard. My dad wants to kill you. And so then later on in verse 9, David continues to serve Saul. He's being very gracious with Saul. Then it says, but an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, this happens again. Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. He finally decided he had had enough. I'll just be honest, after the first spear was thrown, I probably would have had enough, right? But we can all agree here, David's been very patient with Saul, yes? And he's been very gracious with Saul. But at this point, it would probably be totally reasonable for David to be like, okay, I've had enough, and if the opportunity comes up where I can eliminate this problem, I'm going to take it. Can we just be honest? Most of us would think that way, right? Right? Yeah, you don't want somebody coming after you trying to kill you. And so he actually gets two opportunities to do this. 1 Samuel chapter 24, starting in verse 3, it says, he refers to Saul here, came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. So here's what Saul did not know. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with you as you wish. In other words, David, he's unguarded because you're never more unguarded than when you're doing your business in the restroom, right? Right? And they're like, this is the perfect opportunity. He's in a cave, alone, in the dark. You can deal with this right now. So David creeps up unnoticed, but all he does is he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. But afterwards, watch this. David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. And with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. That's pretty mind-blowing, right? Like he's got this opportunity to eliminate a guy who's trying to kill him, and all he does is cut off a part of his robe, and he's like, I shouldn't have even done that. Because this is God's guy. God put him there. And whenever God wants to take him out, God will take him out. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. It's incredible patience. And then he has another opportunity to do a very similar thing. Chapter 26 of 1 Samuel, starting in verse 8. Basically, just to set this up, Saul took his whole army trying to get David. They go to sleep one night. David and one of his guys sneaks into the tent. And this guy named Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of his spear. I won't strike him twice. In other words, David, you ain't even got to do it. I'll take care of it. And I'll just be honest. If I'm David here, then maybe I'm thinking, man, maybe I missed God when I didn't kill Saul when he was doing his business. Like maybe this is God just giving me another opportunity, and maybe I should deal with it right here. But watch what David says here. David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But he doesn't retaliate. That's incredible patience. To have a guy who's been trying to kill you, literally is on the hunt for you to try to kill you, and you've got the opportunity to deal with it, and you're like, I'm going to let it go. I'm going to let it go. If you want an idea of what love is patient looks like this is love is patient. Love has a long fuse, because that's what David had with Saul, a long fuse, so long that even when he had an opportunity to eliminate the problem, he'd let it go. So 3 ideas we get this from this. If you're taking notes, you can jot this down. The first idea is this. The goal is for me to get me right, even if things aren't made right. The goal is for me to get me right, even if things aren't made right. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is this. The goal is not primarily to fix the situation. The goal is for your character to be developed in the process. Now, that's very counter to the way we think of life. We tend to think of life as a vending machine. Like, if I put in this quarter, Coca-Cola comes out. If I put in, I'm nice to them, I'm patient to them, then eventually they shape up and their behavior is fixed. But here's reality, and some of you guys know this. That's not always the way it works, right? In fact, I would say, generally speaking, it's often not the way it works. You're patient with people, and you wait, and you have a long fuse, and they just don't shape up. And that's where we want to make decisions like, well, I'm done with you. I'm cutting you out of my life. I'm going to get payback. I'm going to retaliate, all that sort of stuff. But the goal that we misunderstand is not primarily to fix the situation. Now, does God want the situation fixed? I would say absolutely. But I would argue that even more, God wants you to become more like Jesus in the process. The goal is not for the situation to be rectified to our satisfaction. The goal is for us to be like Jesus. The goal is for me to get me right, for my character to be developed, for me to be conformed to the image of Christ, even when things aren't made right. Romans 8, 28 and 29, it won't be on the screen, but a lot of us know verse 28 in Romans 8, that God works all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose, and we love that verse, but then we ignore verse 29 that says that for those He loves, He foreknew, and He predestined what? To be conformed to His image. We forget the fact that the greatest good is not for everything in our life to be hunky-dory. It's for us to be made like Jesus. That's the goal. So how does that happen? How does that happen when everything else, when people are treating you poorly? Well, I would say the way you be like Jesus, the way you become like Jesus, is you've got to be with Jesus. And David actually gives us a fantastic example of this. There are at least 4 and most likely 5 Psalms that David writes that are all written in the context of Saul is pursuing him. What does this tell us? This tells us that, man, at the height of David's distress, what does he do? He runs to the Lord. He gets in the presence of God. And that's what shapes his character. And I just want to read a part of one of those. Psalm chapter 59, verses 16, 17. This was actually written after Saul had actually thrown the spear at David for the last time. It says at the very beginning that this was when Saul had sent men to watch David's house in order to kill him. David writes this, but I will sing of your strength. He's talking to God here. I'll sing of your strength in the morning. I will sing of your love. For you are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. You are my strength. I sing praise to you. You, God, are my fortress, my God on whom I can rely. What is David doing here? He is running to the Lord. He is spending time with God, even when he's in incredible distress. And I would argue this is the only way his character is shaped to where he can be so patient with Saul. Many times we have a hard time being patient with people because we just don't spend enough time with Jesus. But David gets in the presence of God. He spends time with God, and this helps him to treat other people the way the Lord would have him to treat them. What David understood and what this teaches us is that the point is that our character is developed in the process. The point is not getting the outcome we necessarily want. And so there's 2 things that shape that end up kind of coming out of our character in this. You can write these down. These won't be on the screen. But the first one is this. We learn to slow down. We learn to slow down. We learn to slow way down. And in fact, we did a series on this called In the Madness leading up to Easter. If you didn't get a chance to watch that, you can watch that on our website. But it was all about our need to slow down our lives. Our pace needs to slow down. One of the reasons our lives need to slow down is because we are most impatient with other people when we are in a hurry. For example, when I was first married and super immature, me and my wife were in seminary at the time, and we were like an hour away from the church I was on staff at. And so it was quite a haul to get there on Sunday morning. And I'm the type of person, and if you're wired like this, let me know, that for me, 10 minutes early is on time. Anybody else like that? Yeah, like people cruelly say about us, you like to hurry up and wait. And it's like, no, I like to be there in plenty of time so I can relax as I'm walking in. I actually like watching the previews of the movies. So I can go to the restroom 3 times during it to make sure my bladder is good and empty so I can watch the whole thing and not have to get up in the middle of it. Maybe that's too much information. I don't know. Others of us, we have a much more casual relationship with the clock. For us, it's like, well, if I'm going to eat dinner at somebody's house at 5 o'clock, that really means I could arrive anytime between 5 and 5:30. Who's wired like that in here? We have one person willing to admit it. Who else is wired like that? Who has a casual relationship with the clock? Just admit it. Come on. I know there are more of you. Okay, some of us have a casual relationship with the clock. So this is the dynamic in my marriage. I'm very much a hurry up and wait. My wife, she just kind of has a casual relationship with the clock because she's more relaxed. So when I would have an idea of what time we need to leave and she's still doing her makeup, I would stomp around our little apartment very loudly, and the floors were very squeaky because I'd be like, and then I'd be like, husbands, you know what that's like, right? And your wives would know what that's like. You have your little big bad wolf thing, and Grace is like, when you do that, it just makes me want to go slower. I was so impatient. Why? Because I'm in a hurry. We're always most impatient with other people when we're in a hurry. Our fuse goes down when we're in a hurry, right? And so one of the most important things that has to happen in the process is God wants to teach us to slow down. Because you can't love people until you're going slow. Love does not move 100 miles an hour with its hair on fire. I heard somebody make this statement recently that the speed of love is about 3 miles an hour. It's a walk. It's not a run. We have to slow down, slow way down. And when we slow down, the second thing that starts to happen is we start identifying what's actually important. We identify what's actually important. We identify what we should actually be valuing. I'll give you an example from when we first started LifeSpring, and I'll just be honest, like some of the folks that have been on our staff team, we have mostly volunteer staff, so they're not compensated to stick around. Some of the folks that have stuck around for so long, it is quite amazing to me because I was a piece of work when we started. Like I really was. You can talk to David or Mark or Sheree or Will and Nicole. They'll tell you he was a handful. Here's how messed up I was, guys. We're doing load in, load out over at JCC. There are some of us that are still remember that time. And just for me, when I got done on Sunday, like preaching wipes me out. Like I love preaching, but once I'm done preaching, I'm just tired. And so afterwards, my primary goal back then was I just want to get home and take a nap. Of course, when you have 2 kids, that's no longer a thing. You just start throwing back more coffee. And so I actually said this one time. It was to a guy named John, and he was a very chatty sort of individual, very relational individual. But I'm tired. I already have my little preaching hangover kicking in. Like my little emotions are all over the place, and I'm already kind of grumpy anyway. And so I'm like, hey, let's talk more work. What kind of idiot says stuff like that? As I look back on that, I'm like, I can't believe God let me be a pastor. Because you know what the point of pastoring is? It's to pastor people. What's actually more important? That we get out by 12:15 so Dylan can get a nap by 2? Or is it that we love people in the process? Here's the thing, guys. When you're impatient, the first thing that goes is you do a very poor job of loving people in the process. And you completely miss out on what is actually valuable. Going back to my illustration when we were first married, what's actually most valuable there? That I love my wife well and build my relationship with my wife, or that we get somewhere 10 minutes early? You know what I'm saying? When we're moving at breakneck speed, we forget what actually is most important and what is most actually valuable. By the way, I would never say, let's talk more work now. I still struggle with impatience, don't get me wrong, but I am not the jerk I used to be. Hopefully not, anyway. So, but we have to slow down. We have to slow down, and we have to be made like Jesus, because the most important thing for us in the process is for our character to be shaped, and our character is shaped as we slow down. As we slow down, we actually see what matters, and what matters most in this context, 2 things when we're talking about other people treating you wrongly. The first thing that matters is you stay like Jesus in the process. Your character is developed in the process. You never, ever lose your testimony. But the second thing that really shapes our values is we start to value the other person even though they're doing us wrong. Why? Because that's the heart of God. Yes. That's the heart of God. And you might say, well, what about when things get really, really bad? And here's what we learned from David. You can jot this down. Second big idea. Sometimes we serve. And David did this with Saul. He didn't jump out of his service immediately. Sometimes we continue to stay and serve. Sometimes we separate. And don't get me wrong, guys. There are situations where you really do need to separate. Like particularly when things are maybe abusive, when things are violent. Like you just need to separate. Sometimes you need a period of separation from somebody in your life. You're like, you know what, I cannot think about this coherently right now because I'm so angry. We need some space for a little bit. That's not a bad decision. Sometimes we serve, sometimes we separate, but we never retaliate. We never retaliate. Romans chapter 12 says this, it'll be on the screen. In verse 17 it says this, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Guys, it's amazing how relative our morality can get when it comes to somebody else who's treated us wrongly. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. And by the way, God sets that standard. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it's written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. In other words, how about you wait and let God be God instead of you trying to jump into a spot? On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed them. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you'll heap burning coals on his head. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Sometimes we serve, sometimes we separate, but we never retaliate. And actually, to take that a step further, man, instead of seeking retaliation, we actually seek to bless the other party. Yes. That's a hard pill to swallow. It's a really hard pill to swallow. Because when you get impatient, man, striking back is so natural. When somebody treats you wrongly, striking back is so natural. And I've both gotten this right and I've gotten this wrong. So let me share a couple stories. There's a guy I had to have a really hard conversation with about 16 months ago and that sort of thing. And I thought things went well. And they said they would make some adjustments. They didn't make the adjustments, at least not in the way that I wanted them to do that. And I blew up at the guy. Like I flat out blew up. I was so ticked off and so irritated that, man, I just let him have it. You know what the problem with that is? It made my pride feel really good. I told him, I'd drop the hammer. But it forfeited my ability to influence. And it creates just a lot of regret in me. And see, that's the funny thing about payback, guys. Like, it feels so satisfying in the moment, but we lose our opportunity to speak into somebody's lives, and we just end up with all sorts of regret. But then the worst thing is this, man. We usurp the role of the Holy Spirit by trying to play God instead of just stepping back and being like, okay, God, you know what? You actually are capable of running the universe. And you're capable of changing somebody's heart. And so while there are times where we have to have hard conversations with people, there are also times where we just need to step back and let God be God. And so here's an example where I got it right, or me and my wife got it right. There's a guy, or is a guy, who's a church planter, contacted my wife back in like January for a logo. A logo, she charged like $500 or something like that. He paid a $100 deposit. She's like, once I get the last part of it, you can have the images. The guy stiffed her. And he's a church planter. He's a guy who says he's a pastor. Can I just be honest? That steams me up a lot. And she sent him several invoices, and he just kind of ghosted her. She finally got a way of getting up with him. He's like, okay, I'll end up paying. He didn't. I even reached out to him and said, hey, man, as a pastor, I know you've got more integrity than to do this. And he's like, well, I'm going to pay. And then he blocks both me and my wife on Facebook. And I reached out to another pastor who knew the guy, and he's like, I hate to tell you, but this is not the first. You're not the first person he's done this to. You will probably never see your money. So I know an attorney who looks a lot like me. It's my twin brother. And by the way, if you ever see somebody here in Smithfield and they're wearing a suit and tie, don't say, hey, Dylan, you will never see me in a suit and tie unless I'm doing like a wedding or a funeral, generally speaking, okay? Some of y'all had that experience this Sunday at the lake. You thought Robert was me and all that sort of stuff. It was great. But I was talking to him, and he's like, well, to be honest, you really could sue him and try to extract punitive damages out of him. I was like, well, what are we talking? He's like, you could sue him for like $10,000 or $15,000. Can I just be honest? That sounded really attractive. I'm like, I have plans for $10,000 or $15,000. But something about it just didn't sit right with me. So I texted my pastor, and he's like, honestly, I've been where you are, having run a business, and I just let it go, and just God blessed me tremendously. And, I think it may just be a time to suffer wrong, and so we decided we would suffer wrong. I have no idea what's become of this guy. This has been very recent anyway, so I don't know how the Lord will work it out with him. But what I can tell you is about 3 days after we just let it go, we got like $1,000 in medical reimbursements. Leave room for God to do his thing is the point there. Like we don't have to seek retaliation. Sometimes we serve, sometimes we separate, sometimes we suffer wrong, guys. But man, we never retaliate. And when we don't retaliate, it actually opens the door for God to do his thing in a way that's explainable by God. And it shapes our character in the process. And here's the primary motivation for this. Here's the fuel for this. This is where we land the plane. The reason we never retaliate is because we are to never forget how patient Jesus was and is with you. 2 Peter 3:9, we started there this morning. We're going to end with it. It says this, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. God is patient with us. Jesus is patient with us. How patient with us? Well, it's been 2,000 plus years since he rose from the dead, and he's still waiting. He's patient. He's patient. He waited for me for over 21 years to give my life to Christ. For some of y'all, he waited longer. For some of y'all, he's still waiting. But man, he's not slow. He's patient. He's patient. He's patient. He's willing to put up with all sorts of wrong in the world in the name of waiting on people to give their life to him. Because ultimately, that's the ultimate thing that matters, is whether or not you know Christ. So just think for a second, man, how patient has God been with you? How patient has God been with you? How patient is God being with you? Hopefully, if you maybe haven't gotten anything else out of today, man, hopefully you get the picture that God is very patient with this imperfect pastor. He continues to be patient with me, and he's patient with you. And I don't know what's been done to you. I don't know the story of everything, but what I do know this is, man, nobody's ever done me the wrong that I've done to Jesus by sinning against him. And yet he's patient with me. He died on the cross for me when I didn't deserve it. And he offered me eternal life when I didn't deserve it. He forgave my sins even when I didn't deserve it. So how patient should I be with somebody else? I would suggest as patient as God has been with you. You might say that does not sound like fun. Respectfully, I don't know that Jesus would say being flogged and having a crown of thorns shoved on his head or being nailed to a cross was fun. But he endured that. Why? For me and you. How patient should I be with somebody else? As patient as God was with me. And think about this. You can jot this. Won't be on the screen, but you can jot it down. What if your patience with somebody else? What if you're waiting on somebody else? What if your refusal to seek retaliation on somebody else and instead choosing to love them and bless them and have a long fuse in the process? What if it's your waiting instead of your retaliating that actually opens the door for God to work? And who knows, man, maybe the thing that God is waiting on for him to open on the door is for you to maybe even go a step further and say, I forgive you. And I'm going to be patient with you. That's actually what God calls us to.